The brave rancher woke up to find his unexpected reward, a beautiful Apache wife. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The land stretched wide and unforgiving, an ocean of dust and stone beneath a sun that spared no mercy. The desert plains of the 1800s were a place of survival, not comfort, where each sunrise promised another day of labor, and each sunset reminded men that death lurked in the shadows. It was here, on the edge of the frontier, that one man carved out a life with nothing but his own grit. His name was Calder Hayes, a rancher with calloused hands, a weathered face, and eyes that seemed to hold the horizon itself. Calder's ranch lay several miles from the nearest town, a small collection of saloons, stables, and half-broken homes that barely clung to life. Unlike most men, Calder did not crave the closeness of community. He had chosen solitude. His father's land had become his burden after the old man's passing. And Calder, bound by duty and by something deeper he could never quite name, stayed behind to keep it alive. Day after day, he rode the same fences, tended the same cattle, and worked until sweat soaked through his shirt and the dust clung like a second skin. But survival on the frontier was never just about work. The skies withheld rain for months, and drought threatened his herd with slow starvation. Coyotes circled at night, their howls echoing like omens in the darkness. Even worse were the men, cattle rustlers who preyed on the weak and desperate. Calder had spent more nights than he could count, with a rifle resting across his knees, eyes fixed on the ridgeline, waiting for silhouettes to appear against the moonlight. More than once he had caught them, figures in the dark trying to cut away his herd. He always fought them off, sometimes with words, sometimes with lead. And every time it reminded him that a lone man's ranch was always a target. And then there was the ever-present fear of Apache raids. The ranch lay on land the tribes claimed as their own, and Calder knew they had every right to it. Yet, the war between settlers and tribes was not his choosing. It was simply the world he had been born into. He had seen burned wagons on the trails, had heard the cries of men and women whose homes were taken in fire and arrows. He lived every day with the knowledge that his turn might come at any moment. That knowledge made him sharper, harder, and braver than most. Still, it weighed on him, for he was not a man who longed for war. He only wanted to keep his land standing, his cattle fed, and his name his own. At 32, Calder carried the weight of years heavier than his age. His back was strong, his hands steady, but his heart bore a hollowness no amount of labor could fill. At night, when the wind whistled across the plains and the fire in his hearth dimmed to embers, he often sat with nothing but silence for company. He thought of what he lacked, not money, not land, not strength, but something else entirely. Companionship, the presence of another soul who might soften the edges of a world carved from stone. Yet, Calder had buried such longings deep. Women were scarce on the frontier, and the few who lived in town wanted no part of a man tied to a lonely stretch of land miles from comfort. Still, in the quiet moments, that longing rose. He would find himself staring out across the plains, imagining a voice in the house, laughter carried on the wind, the warmth of another chair pulled close to his fire. Then reality would settle like a cold blanket. The ranch was all he had, and the ranch was all he could hold. Dreams had no place on the frontier. Survival demanded too much to leave room for softer things. Each morning, before the sun crested the horizon, Calder was already awake. His boots crunched against the dry earth as he walked the fences, his shadow long and lean against the pale sand. He patched the boards, mended broken wire, and checked the water troughs, knowing each task was the difference between life and ruin. His horse, a broad-chested bay named Rust, was his only companion. Rust never complained, never judged, only carried him across the land with steady hooves. Calder sometimes spoke to him, words slipping out into the emptiness. But even those conversations ended in silence. The frontier shaped men in two ways. It either broke them or hardened them. Calder Hayes had been hardened, but not without cracks. His bravery was not born of fearlessness, but of necessity. He fought because the land demanded it, because cattle could not protect themselves, and because he had no one else to rely upon. Yet, in the deepest corners of his heart, beneath the armor of calloused skin and steady resolve, lived a loneliness that no rifle or ranch could silence. And so, the days passed, each one a mirror of the last. Work, struggle, silence. Calder thought it might go on forever, that his life would be measured only in seasons of drought and rain, in cattle born and cattle lost. But destiny often waits in the dust, hidden until the right moment. For Calder Hayes, the lone rancher of the frontier, change was coming. And it would not come by storm or by rustlers, but in a form he could never have imagined. A reward waiting for a bravery yet to be tested. The night had fallen heavy, wrapping the plains in a blanket of silence that only the desert could hold. The moon hung pale and watchful, casting long shadows across the ranch. Calder Hayes sat by the hearth, boots propped against the edge of the stone, rifle leaning against his chair. Rust, his horse, shifted restlessly in the corral outside, ears flicking at something Calder could not yet hear. The rancher's instincts sharpened. He had lived long enough on this unforgiving land to know when the quiet was too still, when the darkness carried something more than sleep. The first sound was faint, the drumming of hooves carried by the wind. Calder's head lifted, his body tense. By the time he stepped outside, the faint rhythm had become a thunder, rising like a storm out of the desert. He saw them then. Shadows cresting the ridgeline, a band of Apache warriors on horseback, their silhouettes black against the silver moon. The night shattered with their war cries, arrows slicing the air, torches blazing in their hands. They descended on the ranch like fire on dry brush. Calder did not hesitate. He ran for his rifle, swung it up to his shoulder, and fired. The crack split the night, and one rider fell from his horse. Another volley of arrows answered, striking the posts of his corral, one lodging deep in the wood beside the door. Sparks erupted as a torch hit the outer fence, flames licking upward. His cattle bellowed in panic, stamping and pushing against the fences as chaos spread across the ranch. He moved like a man forged for moments like this, steady and unyielding. He fired again, ducked low, rolled behind a trough as arrows thudded into the dirt around him. His heart pounded, but his hands were steady. This was survival. This was the life he had always known would come crashing down upon him one day. The Apaches swept in fast, their horses kicking up dust, their faces painted with war colors that glowed under the moonlight. Calder knew he could not hold the ranch if they meant to burn it to the ground, yet surrender was not in his blood. He sprinted to the barn, driving back two warriors with quick shots, the report of his rifle echoing against the canyon walls. Inside, he grabbed a lantern, hurled it at the advancing fire, and beat back the flames threatening to swallow the hay. Smoke burned his lungs, but he fought on, refusing to let his livelihood vanish into ash. Then it happened. Amid the storm of fire and arrows, Calder spotted something unusual. One of the Apache riders, younger than the rest, had fallen from his horse. His animal had stumbled near the corral, throwing him hard onto the ground. Calder raised his rifle, instincts telling him to finish the fight. But in the flickering torchlight, he saw the boy clutching his leg, pinned beneath the weight of the horse, unable to rise. The other warriors pressed forward, too locked in the raid to notice their fallen comrade. For a heartbeat, Calder hesitated. He could let the boy lie there and rid himself of one more enemy. But something within him, a code he carried from his father, a voice that told him men were not meant to kill the helpless, stayed his hand. Against every instinct for survival, Calder rushed forward. He dropped his rifle, heaved the panicked horse aside, and dragged the young warrior out from under it. The boy groaned, blood streaking his brow, his leg twisted at an angle that spoke of injury. An arrow hissed past, close enough to brush Calder's sleeve. He looked up to see another Apache drawing back his bowstring, eyes narrowing at the sight of Calder holding their fallen kin. Before the arrow could fly, Calder scooped the boy into his arms, ducked behind the corral, and shielded him with his own body. He shouted out, voice raw against the roar of fire and the screams of cattle. "Enough!" he bellowed, though he knew few words would cross the gap between their tongues. His meaning was in his stance, in the way he stood guard over the fallen warrior. The fighting faltered. A cry rose among the Apaches, sharper and more commanding than the rest. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with feathers in his hair and a paint across his face, reined his horse to a halt. The others pulled back, circling in the dust, their torches casting eerie light over the ranch. Calder met the leader's gaze, chest heaving, hands steady on the injured boy. For a long moment, silence stretched between them. The leader's eyes narrowed, reading Calder not as a faceless enemy, but as a man who had chosen mercy in the midst of war. He raised his hand, and with that simple motion, the attack ceased. The torches lowered, the arrows stilled. The night once again broken only by the crackle of dying fire. Calder did not know what would come next, whether death or reprieve. But one truth had been laid bare under the moonlight. His bravery was not in killing, but in sparing. And though he could not know it then, that single act would alter the course of his life forever. The morning after the raid broke with a sky the color of pale ash. Smoke still curled from the charred edges of Calder's fence, and the smell of burned wood lingered in the air. The rancher moved through the ruins of the night with a weariness deeper than his bones, yet his spirit held steady. He had survived. His cattle were shaken but alive, his house still stood, and the worst of the fire had been beaten back, but his mind replayed one image again and again. The young Apache warrior lying broken in the dirt, and Calder's own hands lifting him to safety. It was an image he could not shake, for it was unlike anything he had ever expected of himself. By noon, the silence of the plains broke once more. Calder saw them cresting the ridgeline, a group of riders, their figures tall and proud against the sun. Apache. But this time, their approach carried no torches, no cries of war. They rode with a solemn purpose, their spears upright, their horses steady. Calder's fingers twitched toward the rifle leaning against the porch rail, but something in their formation told him this was not another attack. Still, his heart beat fast as the riders drew closer, dust rising beneath their hooves. At their head rode the leader he had faced the night before, a man whose presence was as commanding as the desert sun itself. His face was stern, lined with years of battle, feathers braided into his long hair. Calder stood tall on his porch, shoulders squared, refusing to show fear. The riders reined in their horses a short distance from the house, the leader dismounting with deliberate grace. Behind him, 2 warriors carried the injured youth, his leg bound with cloth, his face pale but alive. The leader stepped forward, His dark eyes locked on Calder's. For a long moment, neither man spoke, though the air between them seemed to hum with the weight of unspoken truths. Finally, in measured English, thick with his own tongue, the leader spoke. "You fought with strength," he said, his voice low but strong. "You fought with courage. But more than that, you showed mercy." Calder's jaw tightened. He gave a small nod, uncertain what answer was expected. "I couldn't leave him there," he said simply. "Not like that." The leader studied him, his expression unreadable. Then, with a small motion, he signaled, and one of the riders brought forward a figure Calder had not noticed before. Draped in woven cloth, her long dark hair falling down her back, she sat tall on her horse with a dignity that struck Calder like a blow. Her face was calm, but her eyes burned with quiet fire. She was young, no more than her early 20s, with features both striking and delicate. The kind of beauty that seemed untouched by the cruelty of the frontier. The leader turned to Calder, his words carrying the weight of tradition. "Among my people, honor is not forgotten. You saved one of us when you could have killed him. That is a debt, and a debt must be repaid." He gestured toward the woman. "She is my kin. She will go with you. From this day, she is yours." Calder's breath caught, and for the first time in years, he felt truly unmoored. He stared at the woman, then back at the leader, unsure if he had heard correctly. "Yours?" he echoed, disbelief sharpening his tone. "What are you saying?" The leader's gaze remained steady. "She will live under your roof, walk at your side. She is your wife now. This is our gift, our reward to you." Shock rippled through Calder like a storm across the plains. A wife? From a tribe that had raided his land only hours before? He opened his mouth to protest, but no words came. His life had been one of solitude, and he had long since buried the hope of ever knowing a woman's companionship. And now, without warning, it was being thrust upon him. An unexpected reward for an act of mercy he had never meant to be repaid. The woman dismounted, her steps measured and proud. She stood beside her leader, chin lifted, refusing to meet Calder's eyes. To her, this was as much a command as it was to him. Calder felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders. Not only the shock of a wife he had not sought, but the responsibility of a soul whose life was now bound to his. "I don't," Calder began, but his words trailed off. The leader raised a hand, silencing him. "You will care for her," he said firmly. "You will honor her, as you honored the fallen last night. In this, you honor us." His gaze hardened. "Do not refuse. To refuse would bring dishonor greater than death." Calder's throat tightened. He looked once more at the woman, at the fierce pride in her eyes, at the silent defiance written in the line of her mouth. She was no gift to be claimed, no possession to be owned. She was a person, strong and unyielding in her own right. And yet, she was now his responsibility, a bond he had not chosen but could not break. The leader gave a short nod, then turned back to his horse. The other warriors followed, leaving the woman standing alone at the foot of Calder's porch. The dust of their departure swirled in the air until only silence remained. Calder stood frozen, his heart pounding. He had expected death, perhaps vengeance. Instead, he had been given something far more bewildering. A wife, a woman of the very people he had feared. A woman whose presence now filled the emptiness of his ranch with a weight he could not yet name. The unexpected reward had come, and with it, a new chapter of his life had begun. One that promised not just struggle, but a responsibility deeper than any battle he had ever fought. The house had always been Calder's refuge, a place of silence where the only voices were the creak of timber and the whistle of wind through the cracks. For years, he had known its walls as the borders of his solitude. But now, as the Apache woman stepped through the doorway, the air itself seemed to change. Her presence filled the room with an energy both unsettling and undeniable, a living reminder that his world was no longer his alone. She entered with measured steps, her head held high, her dark eyes scanning every corner of the rancher's modest home. Though she carried no words, her silence spoke volumes. This was not a place she had chosen. Calder watched her, unsure of what to say, his throat tight with the strangeness of it all. He had fought rustlers and faced down war bands, yet nothing felt as disarming as the quiet figure now standing in his parlor. He motioned toward the chair near the hearth, but she did not sit. Instead, she remained standing, arms folded against her chest, her gaze fixed not on him, but on the fire. Calder felt the weight of her pride, the strength she carried even in stillness. This was no meek companion forced into his life. She was a warrior's kin, bound by duty and dignity. The first days passed in awkward silence. Calder rose before dawn, as always, working the fences, riding Rust across the pastures, tending the cattle with steady diligence. She followed at times, watching from a distance, her face unreadable. When he offered her food, she accepted it with quiet reserve. When he spoke, she gave no reply, though her eyes flickered as though she understood more than she let on. The language barrier hung between them like a wall, thick and unyielding. Calder's attempts at words were clumsy, his gestures often met with the faintest arch of her brow, as if she found his efforts almost laughable. Yet there was no cruelty in her silence, only distance. She was a stranger in his house, and he was a stranger to her world. Still, small moments began to shift the air between them. One afternoon, as Calder struggled to repair a broken fence post, she approached quietly, taking the hammer from his hand with a firm grip. Without a word, she set the post straight, her movements efficient and strong. Calder watched, surprised, as she drove the nails with steady precision. She handed the hammer back, her chin lifted slightly, as though to remind him she was no helpless burden. He nodded once in respect, and though no words passed, something unspoken began to grow between them. At night, Calder often caught himself watching her across the firelight. She sat near the hearth, her hair spilling like midnight over her shoulders, her eyes reflecting the flames. There was a calmness in her posture, a quiet defiance that fascinated him. He realized then that she carried bravery not unlike his own, the bravery of someone who faced a world not chosen, yet endured it with dignity. Awkwardness still marked their days, but slowly, familiarity crept in. She began to help in the kitchen, preparing food with herbs she gathered near the creek. Calder tasted flavors he had never known, each meal a quiet bridge between their worlds. When he thanked her in his clumsy words, she gave no reply, but her lips curved ever so slightly, the ghost of a smile that lingered long after. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon in shades of crimson and gold, Calder found her near the corral. Rust had grown restless, stamping his hooves and pulling at the rope. Without hesitation, she stepped forward, laying a gentle hand on the horse's neck. To Calder's astonishment, the animal stilled beneath her touch, his wild energy melting into calm. She whispered softly in her own tongue, her voice low and melodic, and Rust lowered his head in surrender. Calder stood frozen, struck by the quiet power of the scene. In that moment, he saw her not as an intruder, not as a burden, but as someone who belonged to the land as deeply as he did. The nights grew colder, and the walls of the ranch house seemed less empty. Calder no longer heard only silence. He heard the faint rustle of her movements, the soft tread of her steps. It unsettled him at first, yet soon he found comfort in it. He began to notice the strength in her gaze, the way she carried herself with unbroken pride, the subtle kindness in her hands when she tended to the fire or laid a blanket across the chair. Romantic tension grew, not with sudden gestures, but with the smallest moments. His hand brushing hers when passing a bowl, her eyes meeting his across the fire, the brief pauses that seemed to linger longer each night. Neither spoke of it. Yet it hung between them like a flame waiting to catch. For Calder, who had lived years with nothing but emptiness at his side, the presence of another soul was both a gift and a weight. He did not yet know what path this bond would take, but he could no longer deny its power. She was no longer just a stranger in his ranch house. She was becoming part of the air he breathed. The silence he once thought unshakable, now filled with something new, something he could not name, but could feel in every glance, every shared moment. The rancher had been given an unexpected reward, but he was beginning to realize that it was not just a duty thrust upon him. It was a chance, fragile and uncertain, for something his heart had long forgotten: companionship, and perhaps, in time, love. The days following her arrival settled into a fragile rhythm. Calder had grown used to her silent presence in the house, the way she worked beside him without command, the way her watchful eyes seemed to catch every detail. Yet, beneath that calm surface, he sensed a strength, something untested, waiting. He would not have to wait long. Trouble had a way of finding lonely ranches, and Calder's land was no exception. It began with small signs. One morning, he found the fence cut, several cattle missing. Another day, fresh tracks led away into the hills, prints too deep and too deliberate to be wild strays. Calder's gut told him what he already knew: rustlers, rival ranchers perhaps, or outlaws drifting across the frontier, ready to take what they pleased from a man too isolated to defend himself. He cleaned his rifle twice that week, keeping it near at all times. The Apache woman noticed, her dark eyes sharp with understanding, though no words passed between them. The attack came under a blood-red sky. Evening shadows stretched long across the plains when the first gunshot rang out, sharp and sudden, splitting the air. Calder dropped the bucket he carried and sprinted toward the corral, heart hammering. He saw them then. 5 riders tearing across the pasture, rifles raised, laughter carried on the wind. Rustlers. They drove straight for the herd, their shouts sending the cattle into a panicked stampede. Calder fired, dropping to one knee as a bullet whistled past his head. Dust exploded around him as the outlaws returned fire, their horses kicking up clouds that swallowed the fading light. He reloaded fast, but there were too many. They came at him from both sides, closing in with practiced precision. For the first time, Calder felt the weight of true outnumbering, the kind that ended men's lives on forgotten stretches of land. Then she was there. The Apache woman burst from the barn, bow in hand, her hair streaming like a dark banner behind her. She moved with the fluid grace of a hunter, loosing an arrow that struck the nearest rider clean in the shoulder. The man toppled from his horse with a cry, his rifle falling useless into the dirt. Calder froze for an instant, stunned, then fired again, dropping another. The battle turned wild. Flames leapt as one of the rustlers hurled a torch onto the haystack, the fire roaring to life, painting the sky in crimson and gold. Cattle bellowed, breaking through the fences, stampeding in terror. The ranch became a storm of fire, gunpowder, and dust. Calder and the woman fought back to back, their movements unspoken but in perfect rhythm. She loosed arrows with deadly accuracy, each shot finding its mark, while he fired steady, reloading with practiced hands. A rider charged straight at her, pistol raised. Calder shouted, but before he could fire, she spun low, snatching a knife from her belt. In one swift motion, she slashed upward, unseating the rider and sending him crashing to the ground. Calder watched in awe, a surge of respect burning through him. She was no burden, no gift forced upon him. She was a warrior in her own right, as fierce as any man he had ever known. The fight raged on, but together they held their ground. One by one, the rustlers fell or fled, their courage breaking under the relentless defense. When the last rider turned tail into the night, silence fell heavy, broken only by the crackle of fire and the ragged sound of their breathing. Calder lowered his rifle, chest heaving, sweat and soot streaking his face. The barn still burned, flames licking skyward. Without hesitation, the woman ran toward it, grabbing a bucket from the trough. Calder followed, and together they doused the fire, beating back the flames until only smoking embers remained. They worked side by side, their arms aching, their bodies pushed to the edge of exhaustion. When at last the final blaze died, they collapsed against the fence, shoulders nearly touching, the night air thick with smoke. For a long while, neither spoke. The silence between them was no longer awkward. It was alive, humming with something new. Calder turned his head, studying her in the glow of the dying fire. Her face was streaked with dirt, her hair wild, her chest rising with each heavy breath. Yet her eyes burned bright, fierce and proud. He saw not just beauty, but courage, a spirit forged in fire and trial. "You saved this ranch," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. She met his gaze, her lips parting as though she might answer. Instead, she gave the faintest nod, her pride intact, her silence saying more than words could. In that moment, Calder felt a shift within himself. The emptiness that had haunted his nights, the loneliness that clung to him even in daylight. It seemed to waver, replaced by something sturdier. Trust, respect, a bond forged in blood and fire. She was no longer the reward given by her tribe. She was his equal, his partner in survival, a woman whose presence filled the hollow spaces of his heart with something he had thought forever lost. As the stars wheeled overhead and the smoke drifted into the night sky, Calder Hayes understood the truth. This woman was not his burden. She was not his prize. She was his ally, his companion, his true partner. And though the future of their bond remained unwritten, he knew one thing with certainty. Together, they could withstand whatever storms the frontier had left to throw at them. The first rays of sunlight crept over the desert horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The air was cool and still, the silence broken only by the soft rustle of prairie grass and the distant lowing of cattle. For the rancher, this dawn felt different. He had seen countless mornings in his years of toil, but never one that carried with it the promise of something more than survival. Today was not just another day of endless labor. It was the beginning of a new life. Standing beside him, her dark hair catching the glow of the rising sun, was the Apache wife who had once been given to him as an unexpected reward, but who had since become so much more than that. The ranch house had been battered by fire and bullets, and much of the land bore scars from the battles they had fought together. Yet there was life here again. Smoke rose gently from the chimney where she had lit the morning fire, and the rancher could smell the faint aroma of corn cakes and coffee drifting on the breeze. He looked at her as she moved gracefully, carrying a wooden bucket of water from the well. Every step she took was steady and strong, a reminder of the warrior spirit within her. She was no longer a stranger in his home. She had become the very soul of it. Together, they began to rebuild what had been broken. The rancher worked with hammer and nails, setting beams for a new barn, while she wove rugs from dyed wool and stitched clothing from deerskin. The work was slow, but it did not feel like burden anymore. Each plank they lifted, each stone they set, was a piece of their shared future. The silence that had once haunted the rancher's days was gone, replaced by the rhythm of two people moving in harmony. Even when words failed them, his English and her Apache tongue colliding, they found understanding in the simplest gestures. A smile, a hand on the shoulder, or the quiet warmth of sitting side by side beneath the stars. Sometimes, as the days stretched long, the rancher thought back to the emptiness he had once carried inside him. He remembered the lonely nights when the desert wind was his only companion, when the fear of rustlers or Apache raids was all that stirred his heart. But now, those fears seemed like distant shadows. With her by his side, he had found courage not only in defending his land, but in daring to open his heart again. She had shown him that life was not meant to be endured alone. It was meant to be shared, fiercely and tenderly, even in the harshest of places. One evening, as they rested on the porch after a long day, he noticed her eyes following the sunset with a soft, almost wistful look. When he asked what she was thinking, she spoke slowly, choosing her words in broken English. "Sun go down, but always come back. Same, like hope." He sat quietly, the weight of her words settling deep inside him. Hope. That was what she had brought into his life, more than cattle, more than land, more than survival. Their bond had grown strong not just through quiet days, but through fire and blood. She had stood with him when rustlers tried to take everything he owned, her bow and knife cutting through the chaos with the same resolve that burned in his own gunfire. In those moments of danger, he realized she was not a prize to be displayed, nor a reward for his bravery. She was his partner, his equal, his salvation. And now, as they built this new dawn together, he knew that every scar on the land and on their hearts had been worth enduring to reach this place of peace. The rancher never thought of himself as a man lucky in love. He had lost before, felt the sting of grief and the heavy silence of loss. Yet here, on this battered stretch of desert soil, love had found him in the most unlikely form. A woman once considered his enemy, now his most loyal companion. She was his anchor, his strength, and his reminder that even the harshest frontiers could bloom with tenderness if only one dared to nurture it. As the sun climbed higher, spilling warmth over the valley, he took her hand in his, rough palm against hers, both scarred and strong. She looked up at him with eyes that held fire and softness all at once. They did not need to speak. The silence between them was no longer empty, but full, heavy with the promise of a life they would face together. The rancher smiled faintly, for he understood now what true victory meant. It was not measured in acres of land, in cattle herds grazing freely, or in gold locked away. His greatest triumph stood beside him. A woman brave enough to fight, strong enough to endure, and loyal enough to stand with him until his last breath. She had entered his life as a gift, unexpected and confusing, but had become the very heartbeat of his world. The desert stretched endless before them, its trials far from over. There would still be storms, droughts, and dangers. But as they faced the horizon, hand in hand, the rancher knew he was no longer a lone man struggling against fate. Together, They would build, endure, and thrive. And in the quiet of that dawn, he understood at last that the true reward of his life was not his land, his cattle, or even his survival. It was the brave, beautiful Apache wife who had chosen to stand with him in every battle and every dawn to come.